What would be the outcome if all the nations possessing nuclear weapons simultaneously engaged in war and utilized their nuclear potential? In 2019, scientists from Princeton University devised a grim scenario for potential global catastrophe. They envisioned a conflict emerging between Western European nations and Russia, initiated by the bombing of major cities. Picture the sudden disappearance of most of the population in European capitals like Warsaw, Prague, and Berlin. In retaliation, the United States launches nuclear missiles at Moscow and St. Petersburg, followed by 6 other nuclear-armed nations: China, North Korea, France, India, Pakistan, and the United Kingdom, officially confirming their participation in the war. This sequence of events was dubbed Plan A, illustrating the sheer insanity and devastation that would result from the ultimate war in human history. However, history has seen several moments when the world teetered on the brink of a nuclear conflict. What could have transpired if the red button had indeed been pushed? August 6th and 9th, 1945, are etched in history as 2 of the most dreadful days humanity has ever witnessed. It was during these days that nuclear weapons were first employed for military purposes, rather than just in testing. The United States Air Force dropped 2 atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the closing stages of World War II. The repercussions of these explosions continue to haunt us. The atomic bombings claimed the lives of approximately 214,000 people in Hiroshima alone. Shadows are all that remain of those who happened to be outside at the moment of the blast. The world's first nuclear test, codenamed Trinity, took place on July 16, 1945 in the New Mexico desert. This test, designed to assess a plutonium bomb known as the Gadget, surpassed the scientists' expectations in terms of its destructive power. Immediately following Trinity, Lieutenant General Leslie Groves, the military supervisor of the Manhattan Project, informed Oppenheimer that, instead of 2 bombs, they would likely need to drop 3, so which Japanese city would have been the next target? The 3rd bomb was intended for Japan on August 19, 1945. According to declassified conversations between American military officials, the initial target was Tokyo. However, most of Tokyo's industrial facilities had already been heavily bombed, and significant residential areas were destroyed in air raids. Consequently, a nuclear bomb might not have had the same terrifying impact there as it would in a city unaffected by the war. Scientists needed a clearer picture of the destruction's magnitude to continue developing these weapons. Therefore, they considered locations with minimal prior destruction. Yokohama, the second largest Japanese city after Tokyo, Kokura, Niigata, and Kyoto, were all on the list of potential targets. Kyoto, Japan's former capital, had seen little bombing during World War II and was thus a prime candidate. However, a surprising twist occurred when Henry Stimson, the United States Secretary of War, intervened. Stimson continuously tried to convince President Harry Truman not to drop the atomic bomb on Kyoto. Did Stimson truly comprehend the catastrophic consequences, including the loss of millions of lives? Apparently not. Stimson's attachment to Kyoto stemmed from his honeymoon in the city, and he wanted to spare it from destruction. Fortunately, Japan surrendered before any further bombings occurred. But what if the red button had been pushed anyway? Let's imagine that Stimson had successfully persuaded the president not to target Kyoto. In that case, Tokyo would likely have become the next candidate. On the night of August 19, 1945, an aircraft loaded with a deadly payload would have departed from an American military base. Instead of dawn, Tokyo residents would have been greeted by an extraordinarily bright flash, followed by a 21-kiloton explosion that would devastate the city. Around 70,000 people in the epicenter would perish within seconds, with an additional 60,000 suffering severe injuries and lethal radiation doses. Roughly 30% of the city's population would die within minutes, and Tokyo's wooden buildings from the early 20th century would crumble like houses of cards. The Japanese emperor and his government would likely have perished in the attack, as they resided in downtown Tokyo. The consequences of the 3rd atomic bomb would have set Japan back centuries. and the aftermath of World War II would continue to haunt the nation. However, Japan would not have been the sole target. Shortly after World War II, the world found itself on the brink of another full-scale nuclear conflict. A couple of weeks after the victory over Nazi Germany, the United States and the United Kingdom began developing military plans to destroy the Soviet Union. These plans involved a series of nuclear strikes intended to annihilate the communist state. The operation was codenamed Operation Unthinkable, due to the fear that the USSR, with its troops stationed in Europe, posed a potential threat. The US and the UK were concerned about Stalin's unpredictable behavior, which could have led to a new war at any moment. Churchill, the British Prime Minister, even believed that dropping an atomic bomb on the Kremlin could facilitate the takeover of the Soviet Union. Furthermore, a nuclear strike on the USSR was seen as a way to prevent casualties among American and British troops. According to documents between 1945 and 1949, the Pentagon devised a total of 9 plans for a nuclear war against the Soviets. One of the most famous plans, developed in 1949, was codenamed Operation Dropshot. According to this plan, the U.S. would drop at least 300 nuclear bombs and 26,000 tons of conventional bombs on 200 targets in 100 cities and towns across the Soviet Union, including Moscow and Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. Additionally, a land military campaign against the USSR would have commenced to ensure its complete defeat. Records indicate that the war was scheduled to begin on January 1, 1957. However, what prevented the UK and the US from executing these plans? Their primary obstacle was a shortage of atomic bombs and aircraft. By 1948, Washington possessed 50 atomic bombs and only 32 B-29 bombers capable of carrying them. But in 1949, the U.S. produced an additional 250 nuclear bombs, and Operation Dropshot seemed poised to commence. Then came unexpected news that stunned the world. The Soviet Union had successfully developed its own atomic bomb. Although the communist nuclear arsenal was relatively small, the Americans couldn't ignore the fact that the Soviets now possessed such weapons. In 1960, 12 years later, all likely American strategies in the event of a nuclear war were consolidated into a single integrated operational plan. If implemented, this plan would have entailed a massive, simultaneous nuclear strike on nuclear forces, military facilities, and major cities in the USSR, China, and Eastern Europe. U.S. strategic forces would have delivered 3,500 nuclear strikes on these territories within a short time frame. American generals estimated that such an attack would result in the deaths of 285 to 425 million people, with some European allies being annihilated. This plan could have feasibly been put into action. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, the world stood on the precipice of nuclear conflict. October 27, 1962, is famously known as Black Saturday and marked the climax of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which lasted for 13 harrowing days. The world had never been so close to a nuclear war as it was during those 2 weeks. The crisis began in 1960, during the pre-election presidential race in the United States. The Eisenhower administration initiated secret preparations to train Cuban refugees in Guatemala for a guerrilla uprising to overthrow Fidel Castro. Unfortunately, the operation was swiftly exposed, and on April 17, 1961, Cuban refugees landed on the Bay of Pigs, where they aimed to gather support for their rebellion. However, it took only a few days for Castro's forces to quell the rebellion. Following this failure, Castro sought assistance from the USSR to protect his regime. Khrushchev decided to send missiles to Cuba in secret to restore the balance of power. By the time the Americans became aware of these developments in October 1962, Khrushchev had already deployed 40,000 troops and over 160 nuclear warheads to Cuba. On October 16, 1962, President John F. Kennedy received intelligence about the existence of Soviet intermediate-range missile launch sites in Cuba, marking the beginning of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy's primary objective was to remove the missiles from Cuba while avoiding a nuclear exchange. He initially proposed a blockade, which was later termed a quarantine, to soften its implications. Little did he know that at that moment, a Soviet submarine, the B-59, armed with a 15-kiloton nuclear warhead, was submerged near Cuba. The submarine was struggling in the warm waters of the Sargasso Sea, with its internal temperature rising to critical levels. The submarine's crew experienced severe discomfort, with some members fainting due to the oppressive conditions. Meanwhile, American destroyers patrolled the sea above the submarine, preventing it from surfacing to recharge its batteries or use its antenna. The submarine's captain, Valentin Savitsky, was unaware of recent developments due to the lack of radio signals. Suddenly, a series of underwater explosions shook the submarine. Communications specialist Vadim Orlov described the sensation as being locked in a metal shell pounded by a sledgehammer. In line with the protocol for such situations, American military ships dropped non-lethal depth charges to signal the submarine to surface. However, on that fateful day, someone decided to use live hand grenades instead. Savitsky ordered his crew to prepare to return fire, believing that a full-scale nuclear war had erupted. What those dropping the grenades did not know was that the B-59 was carrying what Soviets referred to as special ammunition, a nuclear warhead. Only a few seconds separated the world from a nuclear war. Fortunately, Vasily Arkhipov, a Soviet Navy captain also on board the submarine, had experience with the consequences of nuclear weapons. He had served on the K-19, the first nuclear submarine armed with nuclear weapons, which faced a catastrophic reactor cooling system failure in 1961, resulting in the deaths of 7 crew members. The surviving crew members referred to the K-19 as the Hiroshima. Understanding the catastrophic potential of nuclear weapons, Arkhipov tried to persuade Savitsky not to launch the missiles. Thankfully, his reasoning prevailed. Thus, a full-scale nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union was averted. Had the B-59 launched its missiles, it would have triggered an immediate response from the United States, launching missiles from its Turkish base, while the USSR would have retaliated with missiles from Cuba. Not only would the Soviets and Americans have suffered, but Turkey and Cuba would also have been annihilated. Such an exchange would have resulted in the deaths of 360 million people. Moreover, massive amounts of radioactive dust and soot would have been ejected into the atmosphere, leading to a significant global temperature drop of nearly 7 degrees Celsius. This, in turn, would have initiated a nuclear winter, causing widespread famine and the deaths of nearly half of the world's population. Fortunately, on that fateful day, the wise decision was made not to push the red button. However, the world failed to learn its lesson. 21 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, on September 26, 1983, the world once again found itself on the precipice of nuclear disaster. Early in the morning, Stanislav Petrov, an officer at a command post for a space-based missile detection system, received a notification of a U.S. missile strike. The computer indicated that several missiles were headed toward the USSR. Following protocol, Petrov should have immediately reported the strike, leading to a swift retaliatory nuclear strike by the USSR. However, Petrov hesitated and chose to verify the information. He contacted satellite radar operators who confirmed that they had not detected any missiles. Yet Petrov was caught in a dilemma. He had to decide whether to inform the Soviet government of an imminent missile attack or a possible system malfunction. Choosing the former would have triggered an immediate nuclear response, potentially leading to a global catastrophe. Eventually, Petrov reported a system malfunction, and his decision likely prevented a nuclear war. If he had chosen differently, the number of casualties worldwide could have reached hundreds of millions. But even these incidents did not serve as adequate lessons. In early 2023, the doomsday clock stood just 90 seconds from midnight, the closest it had ever been in history. This move was prompted by the war Russia initiated in Ukraine, endangering not only Ukraine but also Taiwan, threatened by China. Japan, too, is at risk due to North Korean missiles targeting Tokyo. If world leaders were to initiate a full-scale nuclear war and push their red buttons, around 4,500 nuclear bombs would be launched into the air. These explosions would release approximately 150 million tons of radioactive dust into the atmosphere. The resultant blockage of sunlight would lead to a temperature drop of nearly 7 degrees Celsius globally, triggering a nuclear winter. Mass famine would ensue, and almost half of Earth's population would perish. It's important to remember that this scenario only accounts for half of the world's nuclear arsenal. If all nuclear weapons were employed, the consequences would be even more catastrophic, with unimaginable suffering and destruction on a global scale. Let us hope that history serves as a stark reminder of the dire consequences of nuclear war, prompting nations to prioritize diplomacy, disarmament, and peace, rather than ever again approaching the brink of doomsday. Subscribe for more.